Picture a man sitting in a church pew on a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1911. A lean, pale, almost skeletal figure in his early 70s, with pale blue eyes that gave nothing away, and a habit of carrying dimes in his pocket to press into the hands of passing strangers. Children mostly, as though the act of giving away 10 cents at a time could somehow balance the ledger of a life spent accumulating everything. His name was John Davison Rockefeller. He was, at that precise moment, almost certainly the richest private individual who had ever lived on this planet. A man whose fortune, expressed in modern terms, would sit somewhere between $300 and $400 billion. And the reason we are watching him in that church pew on that particular morning is that 2 weeks earlier, on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States had just handed him the greatest victory of his entire career, disguised for public consumption as the worst defeat of his life. The ruling made the front page of every major newspaper in America. Editorial writers celebrated. Reformers who had spent a decade fighting Standard Oil raised glasses. The cartoonists who had spent years drawing Rockefeller as a monstrous octopus with tentacles wrapped around the nation's oil supply drew him, finally, in defeat. The story the country told itself was clear and satisfying and almost entirely wrong. The government, acting in the name of the people, had faced down the most powerful monopoly in American history, sliced it into 34 separate companies, and restored competition to an industry that had been strangled by one man's greed. The little guy had won. The system had worked. What the newspapers did not report, because the numbers were not yet in, was what happened to the stock. What the editorial writers did not calculate, because the math would have been embarrassing, was what the breakup actually did to John D. Rockefeller's personal net worth. What the reformers who celebrated did not understand, and what would become one of the most ironic facts in the history of American capitalism, was that the Supreme Court ruling of 1911 did not break Standard Oil. It multiplied it. The man who walked into that courtroom as the owner of the most hated monopoly on earth walked out, within 2 years, as a man more than twice as rich as he had been when the case began. Today, we are going to open the books. We are going to sit in the actual rooms where these decisions were made, follow the money through the breakup, trace the so-called baby standards from 1911 to the present day, and find out what actually happened when the government attempted the most famous antitrust action in American history. Because the real story is not a story about the triumph of regulation. It is a story about what happens when you shatter a monopoly without understanding why the monopoly worked in the first place. And it is a story with direct, immediate consequences for the world you live in today, because the companies that emerged from Standard Oil's wreckage are still among the most powerful corporations on Earth. They just go by different names now. Let us begin at the beginning, with the man and with the system he built, because you cannot understand what the breakup actually did without first understanding what Standard Oil actually was. John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in upstate New York, the son of a traveling patent medicine salesman, who was, by most accounts, a charming fraud. He was raised in a household of careful economies and rigid Baptist piety, a combination that produced in him a lifelong conviction that making money and doing God's work were essentially the same thing. He was not an inventor. He was not a wildcatter who struck oil in the Pennsylvania hills. He arrived in the oil business in 1863, after the first Pennsylvania oil boom had already happened, and he immediately understood something that almost everyone else in the industry had missed. The problem with oil in the 1860s was not finding it. The problem was refining it and distributing it. The Pennsylvania oil fields were chaos. Drillers struck wells, flooded the market, prices collapsed, half of them went broke, new wells opened, the cycle repeated itself with ruinous regularity. The men who pumped the oil were at the mercy of the market in a way that Rockefeller found not just economically foolish, but almost morally offensive. He was a man who hated waste with a physical intensity, who kept meticulous ledgers from the time he was a teenager, who once famously drove his own accountants to distraction by demanding to know why a particular shipment of barrels used 39 drops of salter per lid rather than the standard 40. 39, it turned out, worked perfectly fine and cost slightly less. That was Rockefeller. Every drop counted. Every cent was tracked. What he saw, with absolute clarity, was that the money in oil was not in drilling. It was in refining and, above all, in transportation. The railroads that carried refined oil to market were the real choke point of the entire industry. And if you could control the railroads, you could control everything else. In 1870, he founded the Standard Oil Company of Ohio with a capital of $1 million and immediately began negotiating secret rebates from the railroads, agreements in which Standard Oil would receive a portion of its own shipping charges back from the railroad in exchange for guaranteeing steady, high-volume traffic. But Rockefeller did not stop there. He negotiated something even more audacious, a provision called the drawback, under which Standard Oil would receive a rebate not only on its own shipments, but on the shipments of its competitors. Every barrel of oil a rival company shipped on those railroads generated a secret payment back to Rockefeller. His competitors were subsidizing his expansion without knowing it. By 1872, Rockefeller had moved to absorb virtually every refinery in Cleveland in what he simply called the Cleveland Massacre. In the space of 3 months, he approached 22 competitors and offered each of them the same choice. Sell to Standard Oil at a price Rockefeller had set, or watch as Standard undersold them, outcompeted them on every shipment, and drove them out of business. Most sold. Some fought and lost. Within a year, Standard Oil controlled 25% of American refining capacity. By 1879, it controlled 90%. This is the part of the Standard Oil story that most people know, at least in outline. What is less often discussed is the legal structure Rockefeller invented to hold the whole empire together, a structure so novel that it required the invention of an entirely new word to describe it. Standard Oil became, in 1882, the first great American trust. The idea was elegantly simple and profoundly far-reaching. The stockholders of Standard Oil and all the companies it had absorbed across Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, and beyond surrendered their individual stock certificates to a group of 9 trustees in exchange for trust certificates of equivalent value. The 9 trustees, of whom Rockefeller was the dominant figure, then controlled the entire combined enterprise as a single coordinated unit. What this meant in practice was that Standard Oil could behave simultaneously as a single monopoly and as a collection of independent companies, underselling a competitor in one state while raising prices in another, cutting pipeline access to a rival refinery while appearing, in each individual state, to be doing nothing more than ordinary business. It was a structure specifically designed to outrun the jurisdiction of any single state's laws, and for nearly a decade, it worked perfectly. The attack came not from the government, but from a woman with a notebook. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and she was the daughter of a Pennsylvania oil man whose independent refinery had been destroyed in Rockefeller's Cleveland campaign. She had grown up watching the wreckage that Standard Oil left behind, watching her father's neighbors sell their equipment at pennies on the dollar, watching the independent oil men of her region slowly crushed by a force that operated through channels too invisible and too complex to fight. She went to college, which women rarely did in the 1870s, became a journalist, went to Paris, came back to write for a small but ambitious magazine called McClure's, and in November of 1902 published the first installment of what would eventually become a 19-part series titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. What Tarbell did, over 4 years of research across thousands of pages of court documents and hundreds of interviews with former Standard employees, was make the invisible visible. She translated the abstract language of corporate manipulation and railroad rebates into human stories that anyone could understand. She put faces on the people Standard Oil had destroyed and names on the mechanisms Standard Oil had used to destroy them. She reproduced from court records the actual text of the secret railroad rebate agreements. She showed, in plain arithmetic, exactly how Rockefeller's competitors had been systematically ground to nothing. And she did all of this in prose that was precise and devastating, entirely free of the florid moralizing that most reform journalism of that era relied upon. She simply laid out the facts and let them speak. The series reshaped the way the American public understood the relationship between concentrated corporate power and ordinary working life. It set in motion a chain of political events that led, eventually, to the most consequential antitrust case in American history. The legal attack came under Theodore Roosevelt, who had built his political identity around the idea of challenging the great trusts. In 1906, the federal government filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey, the holding company into which Standard had reorganized after Ohio courts had dissolved the original trust structure in 1892, charging it under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which declared every combination and restraint of trade to be illegal. The case took 5 years to wind through the courts. It generated transcripts running to tens of thousands of pages. And on May 15, 1911, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Standard Oil of New Jersey was an illegal combination in restraint of trade and ordered it dissolved. The court gave Standard Oil 6 months to break itself apart. What emerged, after the lawyers and accountants finished their work, were 34 separate companies, each one taking a portion of the original empire. Standard Oil of New Jersey would become Exxon. Standard Oil of New York would become Mobil. Standard Oil of California would become Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana would become Amoco. Standard Oil of Ohio would become the American footprint of what is today BP. Continental Oil became Conoco. Atlantic Richfield became Arco. There were pipeline companies and marketing companies and production companies spread across the country, each one a fragment of what had been a single unified machine. And now we arrive at the number that breaks the conventional story of the Standard Oil breakup in half. On the day the Supreme Court issued its ruling, shares of Standard Oil of New Jersey were trading at around $650 per share. Within 18 months of the breakup, as investors began to understand what they were actually looking at, the combined market value of the 34 new companies substantially exceeded the value of the original single company. The broad consensus among economic historians is that the total market value of Standard Oil, measured as the sum of all its successor companies, roughly tripled in the 2 years following the dissolution. Some estimates put the increase significantly higher. John D. Rockefeller held approximately a quarter of all Standard Oil shares. He had, in the years before the dissolution, become somewhat disengaged from the company's day-to-day management. But he held his stock. He held it throughout the legal battle. He held it through the dissolution. And as the stock prices of the successor companies climbed month after month through 1912 and 1913, Rockefeller found himself in the genuinely extraordinary position of watching the breakup of his company make him wealthier at a pace he could never have achieved by keeping it intact. By some calculations, in the 2 years after the dissolution, Rockefeller's personal fortune increased by more than $900 million in the money of 1913. By the time his net worth peaked, sometime around that year, he had become, in modern equivalent terms, the first person in human history whose wealth could reasonably be compared to the gross domestic product of a major nation. The man the government had set out to humble had been, through the mechanism of the market's own response to the breakup, made richer than any private individual had ever been. How did this happen? The answer is not complicated, and it is the reason this story matters so much to anyone who wants to understand how markets and monopolies actually work. Standard Oil as a single company was valued by the market at a price that reflected, among other things, the substantial legal risk the company faced, the uncertainty around whether and when the government might succeed in dismantling it, and the discount the market applied to a business operating under constant antitrust threat. When the Supreme Court dissolved that uncertainty by actually ordering the dissolution, 2 things happened simultaneously. First, each successor company could be valued on its own merits, without the legal risk discount dragging down the combined entity. Second, and more importantly, investors suddenly understood that the individual pieces of the Standard Empire, freed from the old trust structure and appearing as separate businesses on the open market, were each genuinely valuable enterprises with substantial assets and cash flows. The breakup, paradoxically, made the value of what Standard Oil had built legible to the market in a way it had never been when it was all wrapped up in a single opaque holding company. The Supreme Court did not destroy a monopoly's value, it unlocked it. But there is a third dimension to this story, one that takes decades to fully play out, and that is in many ways the most revealing of all. The 34 successor companies did not remain 34 separate competitors for very long. The pressures of the oil industry, the capital-intensive nature of exploration and production, the advantages of scale in refining and distribution, the underlying logic of vertical integration that Rockefeller had originally understood and exploited so brilliantly, all of these forces pushed the pieces of Standard Oil back toward each other with the slow, relentless gravity of large masses in space. It did not happen all at once. The reunification of Standard Oil was a process that stretched across nearly a century, proceeding quietly in the language of mergers and acquisitions and strategic partnerships, mostly below the threshold of public alarm. Standard Oil of New Jersey, which became Esso and eventually Exxon, absorbed smaller companies across the following decades. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. And then, in 1999, Exxon and Mobil merged in a deal worth $73 billion, the largest corporate merger in American history at that point, recreating in a single transaction a substantial portion of what the Supreme Court had spent 5 years breaking apart. Chevron, heir to Standard Oil of California, merged with Gulf Oil in 1984, with Texaco in 2001, with Unocal in 2005. BP acquired Amoco, Standard Oil of Indiana, in 1998. Conoco merged with Phillips Petroleum in 2002. Arco was absorbed by BP in 2000. The reconsolidation was so thorough and so systematic that a serious argument can be made that the oil industry of the present day is, in terms of the concentration of power and the identity of the dominant players, more similar to the Standard Oil era than to any point in between. The most extraordinary fact of all, a fact that sits at the center of this entire story and refuses to be argued away, is this. The largest oil companies in the world today include ExxonMobil, Chevron, and BP. Those 3 companies, between them, are the direct corporate descendants of perhaps 20 of Standard Oil's 34 successor companies. The monster that the Supreme Court killed in 1911 did not die. It went underground, waited for a century, and grew back. Now it would be too simple, and also false, to say that nothing changed. Something real did happen in 1911, the absolute stranglehold that Standard Oil had exercised over the refining and distribution of American oil. The system of secret railroad rebates and drawbacks that had made genuine competition functionally impossible. That system was broken. Independent oil companies were, in the years after the ruling, genuinely more able to survive and compete than they had been before. The Texas oil boom, the Oklahoma fields, the California expansion, all produced real independent challengers to Standard's dominance that might not have survived in the pre-breakup environment. The industry became more diverse, at least for a generation, but the underlying logic that Rockefeller had perceived in 1870, the logic that said oil was too capital-intensive, too geographically sprawling, too technically complex to be efficiently managed as a collection of small competing firms, that logic did not disappear because a court issued an order. It persisted, and it pulled the industry back toward concentration as predictably as water runs downhill. There is a harder question underneath all of this, and it is the one that makes this story genuinely uncomfortable for anyone who wants to believe that the Progressive era's war on the trusts was a clear-cut victory. The question is this: what was the antitrust action actually for? If the breakup of Standard Oil made Rockefeller significantly richer, failed to permanently reduce concentration in the industry, and produced successor companies that reconsolidated within a century into essentially the same dominant players, then what exactly was accomplished? Part of the answer is political, and it matters. The antitrust action satisfied a genuine public demand that the government be seen to act against concentrated corporate power. It demonstrated that even the richest man in the world was subject to the law. A democracy in which the most powerful private interest is visibly and publicly constrained by the courts is different from one in which it is not, even if the constraint turns out to be less final than it appeared. Ida Tarbell's journalism and Theodore Roosevelt's prosecutions changed what was politically possible in America, shifted the terrain on which corporate power had to operate, and established precedents that were used to constrain other industries for decades to come. But the limits of that achievement are real, and honesty requires naming them. The Progressive era's war on the trusts did not solve the problem of concentrated economic power. It displaced it. It pushed it underground. It forced consolidation to happen more slowly and with better legal camouflage. And then, over the course of a century, when the regulatory environment relaxed and the political pressure eased, the concentration came back. In oil, in telecommunications, in banking, in airlines, In almost every major industry, the antitrust movement had claimed as a victory. The Standard Oil story, honestly told, is not the story of a great populist triumph. It is the story of a game in which the rules were changed just enough to make the game look different, while the fundamental incentives and power structures that had produced the monopoly in the first place remained exactly where they had always been. And the man who had built the monopoly was patient enough, and wealthy enough, and right enough about the underlying economics, to simply sit in his church pew and wait for the market to tell him what had really happened. Which it did. In the form of a stock portfolio that roughly tripled, while the editorial writers were still congratulating themselves. Rockefeller lived until 1937. He died at 97, which is remarkable in itself, particularly given that he spent decades under a level of public hatred that would have broken most people. He spent his last 4 decades giving away money on a scale that was itself unprecedented, funding the University of Chicago, founding the Rockefeller Foundation, endowing medical research institutions whose work contributed to eradicating diseases that had killed millions. Whether that philanthropy was genuine atonement or extraordinarily sophisticated reputation management is a question historians still argue. Probably it was both. But the most revealing thing about Rockefeller in his final years is not his philanthropy. It is his portfolio. He held his Standard Oil shares, and the successor shares they became, through the dissolution and through the decades of quiet reconsolidation that followed, sitting at his retirement estate at Pocantico Hills in New York, watching the companies the government had broken apart slowly find their way back toward each other. Watching, in other words, the market confirm what he had known since 1870, that the logic of the oil business pushed toward concentration, that the fragmentation the courts had ordered was not the natural state of the industry, but a temporary interruption of it, and that the people who held the right assets at the moment of maximum public hostility would, in time, be rewarded simply for their patience. He had not won by fighting the government. He had not won by lobbying or by some legal maneuver that outsmarted the justices. He had won, in the end, simply by being right about the economics of the business he had built, and by living long enough for the market to agree with him. There is a lesson in that, and it is worth being precise about what the lesson actually is. It is not that regulation is useless. It is not that governments should not attempt to constrain monopoly power, because the alternative, a country in which no check exists on what a Rockefeller can build, is far worse. The lesson is more specific and more demanding than that. Regulation aimed at breaking apart a business without changing the underlying economics that made the business consolidate in the first place will not produce permanent fragmentation. It will produce a pause. And the people best positioned to benefit from the pause are the ones who already own the assets when it happens. The monopoly the Supreme Court killed in 1911 is still with us. It simply needed a century to put itself back together. If you made it all the way through this one, drop a barrel of oil in the comments, just so I know who stayed for the whole story. If you appreciate history told straight, with the myths stripped away and the real mechanics laid out honestly, then subscribe, because that is exactly what we do here every single week. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.